Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Could I welcome you all to today's meeting of the Public Petitions Committee? And as always, can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones or any electronic equipment because it interferes with our sound system. Apologies have been received from Jackson Carlaw, who is attending the Health and Sport Committee, and Cameron Buchanan is in attendance as substitute. Apologies have also been received from David Torrance, and Jim Eady is attending as in absence. And I'm sure that all committee members would wish to pass our condolences to David Torrance on the loss of his father. Agenda item 1, consideration of current petition. The first item of business is consideration petition PE 1512 by Bill Chisholm on amendments to the Freedom of Information Act 2002, and as previously agreed, the committee will retain evidence from the Scottish Information Commissioner. Members have a note by the clerk. It's paper 1, the submissions from the Commissioner and the petitioner. And could I welcome the Commissioner today, Rosemary Agnew. Thank you very much for coming along. And Sarah Hutchison, who is the Head of Policy Information Commissioner's Office. Can I invite Rosemary Agnew to make an opening statement of around 5 minutes, after which I'll move to questions. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present to the committee on this petition. Ultimately, I respect that it's Parliament's role to legislate, and what I aim to do today is simply to inform you to aid that legislative process. I'd like to open by emphasising that I think there is more common ground between myself and Mr Chisholm than might be immediately apparent. And I'm actually grateful to him for raising this issue because it has brought something to the fore. I believe that Mr Chisholm and I are starting from the same point. We want Scottish public authorities to be open, transparent and honest in their communication, and for citizens to be confident they're being told the whole and accurate story within the law. Where I think Mr Chisholm and I have differing perspectives is I take the view that the current legislative framework, that's the Freedom of Information Scotland Act, FOISA, and beyond, largely provides for that. The main focus of the petition is that the law does not specify that authorities must provide accurate and up-to-date information. What it actually specifies is they must provide the information they hold. Now, my understanding is that Mr Chisholm requested information from the Scottish Borders Council, was given information which he had good reason to believe was wrong, as in factually incorrect. He challenged this and the Council gave him further information, and he was understandably unhappy that the Council did not give him all the information it held on the first pass. And he appears to have interpreted this as dishonest behaviour, resulting in him getting what he sees as inaccurate information. Now, I can only assume that as he didn't take up his right to appeal to me, that he was content that ultimately he received all the information the Council held in relation to his request. So in this context, I can only speak hypothetically from what I understand of his experience through this petition process. What I can't know for certain is whether there was dishonest behaviour, but what I can conclude with some confidence is that the Council did not get it right first time. Had they done so, he would have received all the information, which I assume ultimately he was happy with, the first time of asking. Now, the evidence last week emphasised Mr Chisholm's concern that authorities do not have to behave in an honest and truthful way. I think they do. But I think that FOISA is only one part of the framework that aims to ensure that that is the case. And I think it could be potentially damaging to consider FOISA in isolation of other legislation relating to a range of subjects which include conduct in public life, public record keeping, and the way public authorities report. But I think it might be helpful to consider a couple of conceptual points too. Firstly, the nature of accuracy in the context of this debate, because my take on Mr Chisholm's case is that it appears it was the application of FOISA that was inaccurate, in the sense that had the authority applied FOISA accurately in the first place, all the information held would have been given to Mr Chisholm. And FOISA has a remedy for this if it's not the case. Now, another way of looking at this concept of accuracy is to refer to the accuracy of the information on the page. Put crudely, were the numbers on the page the real or the right ones? Now, this fundamentally changes the nature of the accuracy debate in relation to FOISA, because it moves FOISA away from being one of challenging access to information to one of where we're potentially having to check documents are right before they are issued in order to determine even if they should be disclosed. I'd also like to consider, secondly, the nature of honesty in the context of this debate, because we could ask the hypothetical question, did the Council act honestly but mistakenly when it gave out partial information, or did it act dishonestly by knowingly not giving out information the first time round? Now, we can't know that, but an investigation under FOISA could have got a view on that. So we then come to whether information is correct or right when it's disclosed. And I think what FOISA adds here is it can help by ensuring that the information is disclosed, thus making it public and enabling wider scrutiny in relation to its accuracy or truthfulness. Now, this does come up in appeals to me, so sometimes we'll see a requester gets access to information to test the probity of a decision, for example, by an authority. They may want facts or analysis that the authority considered. And if the requester can prove that the fact or analysis was wrong, then they could challenge that authority's decision. They are holding them accountable and enabling that sort of scrutiny. And there have been some very noticeable cases where this has worked. The important point is that FOI gives a right to see the information the authority holds. And if we get the information and then find it is inaccurate, we can use this fact and challenge appropriately through the appropriate legislation. Now, FOISA can also help that if such scrutiny suggests that what was disclosed was inaccurate because it was altered or because it was deliberately withheld, there is provision to investigate this further as a criminal matter. And I think my last briefing covered that in more detail. So we have a strong law in Scotland. It's recognised internationally, and that one of the strongest aspects of this regime is because of its enforcement provisions. We can enforce every step of the way, and a Commissioner's decision is binding. Now, our FOI law is also stringent in other ways that may be not immediately apparent, but it's not often appreciated. I'm obliged by law to accept all valid appeals. That means that I have to issue a decision notice. I can't choose which cases I look at, which means the citizen has the right, if they make a valid appeal, to get a decision from me. So there is always that scrutiny. They're legally enforceable, and it's an indication, I think, of our enforcement powers, a good indication that it's successful, because to date no Scottish public authority has failed to comply with a Commissioner decision. They may have challenged a few through the Court of Session, but they haven't failed to apply them. Now, if I find that an authority has acted unlawfully, i.e. they haven't followed the provisions of the Freedom of Information Scotland Act, it's reflected in a decision notice, and these get various different ways of being reported on and used by others, but I think they constitute this public reprimand that the petition is calling for. And as my previous briefing covered, you'll have seen the information on Section 65 of FOISA, which is the one that enables us to challenge and potentially investigate as a criminal matter deliberate changing of information. And ultimately, if it is found to be the case, there could be a fine of up to £5,000. The one thing I would emphasise about Section 65, though, is it was recently updated through the Freedom of Information Scotland Amendment Bill and put right what we saw as a flaw as to when cases could be brought on these sort of allegations. It's probably also worth sharing with you the one Section 65 case that I've been personally involved in didn't end in a prosecution. It was investigated, But the important point was it did result in accurate information being disclosed to the requester. The original information was inaccurate. What they ended up with was accurate. So in summary, my concern with the part of the proposal in this petition which relates to public bodies being duty-bound to provide accurate information is that it fundamentally changes the nature of FOISA and I think could impose a significant resource burden for something that is already capable of being addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very detailed presentation. I have a couple of points and then I'll ask my colleagues to get involved. Firstly, what merits do you see in Mr Chisholm's petition?
Well, I think the very fact it was raised is a merit in itself, because what it has enabled us to do, me particularly, is look at the information and guidance that I give out. And actually one of the things that I'm going to do is see whether this concept of accuracy as a piece of guidance can't be built in. So it's raised the profile. I think the main merit of it is it's raised a much wider issue, which is public bodies should be held to account. And FOISA is one way of doing this, but it's I think, this issue that FOISA is one way, and the fact that somebody has called for an amendment means that the world is watching, and we do want to see authorities behave properly.
I think you partly answered my next question, which is, do you feel that the 2002 Act needs strengthening, and if so, in which ways?
I think if you ask a commissioner if it needs strengthening, they'll always say yes, because we always find some things. I think for me, the strengthening parts of FOISA are not related to enforcement, that actually the bits that need strengthening are more related to proactive publication, because the ideal would be for authorities to have given information out without being asked. And at the moment, the enforceability of some of that, I think, is not as strong as it might be.
Thank you. And my final question before I bring my colleagues in. As I understand it, you do have a power to refer to the Court of Session. If that is correct, how many times have you done that since you've been in office?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
As I understand it, you do have a power to refer to the Court of Session if you feel the Act's been breached. How many times have you done that as long as you've been Commissioner?
I haven't done that since I've been Commissioner. Certainly haven't done it with any decisions, as in all my decisions have been complied with. I also have powers to issue information notices. So if authorities are not giving me information, which I think is necessary for my statutory function, I can serve a notice on them. I've come close to getting to the Court of Session with a couple of those, but ultimately I haven't had to take that final enforcement step. Authorities have complied.
Could you describe then to the committee in which types of circumstances would you refer to the Court of Session?
I would refer to the Court of Session if I had issued a decision which called for an authority to take action and they point-blank refused to do it. And there were no other circumstances around it. It's a very expensive step to go to the Court of Session, so if I was in a position where I was considering it, I would certainly try and have a dialogue with all the parties first. But if they don't comply, I will go to the Court of Session.
Ultimate sanction.
Yes.
Right. Thank you for that. Chet Brodie.
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
I think in the evidence that we had from Mr Chisholm, I think at the end of it, my interpretation was that he accepted that the process had perhaps not been followed. I just wonder if you might enlighten me as to whether or not you've had similar cases in terms of questionable accuracy. And associated with that, I'm not sure that's what you meant when you said what it has is brought to the fore certain issues. So I wonder what certain issues are. But have you had similar circumstances?
Yes. The basic process that FOISA provides for is if you can't find information that an authority holds because it's not on its website or elsewhere, you can request it. you have a statutory right to receive it or an explanation in law as to why it's not going to be disclosed within 20 days. If you don't receive it or you are dissatisfied with what you get or the service, the way it's been handled, you can then ask the authority for a review. And the review stage really is the one where authorities have the chance to put things right. They sort of get it right second time, if you like. Now, ultimately, if there is anything about that that the requester is dissatisfied with, they can appeal to us. And it's not uncommon for requests at appeals to end up with us, where we have, as part of our investigation, or sometimes as a final decision, told the authorities to conduct further searches. We often give them, please search under these terms. Have you looked for what you might hold here? And I would say it's not a deliberate thing by authorities. I think it's just a reflection that they don't always get the searching, locating of their own information right. Now, I don't know in Mr. Chisholm's case, obviously, because we hadn't investigated, but it is a fairly common element of the appeals that come to me. But the other thing I would add about appeals, to put it in some sort of context, is we've been collating national statistics on FOI for the last year from authorities, and we believe there are in excess of 60,000 freedom of information requests recorded as such in Scotland over last year. Just under 1% of them ended up in appeals, which I think puts it in a context that just over 99% of them didn't end up in appeals to the Commissioner.
Just on that point, to make it's preempted a question I was going to ask about how many complaints are referred to you. I mean, you have a very key, in fact, a critical position in ensuring there is transparency in the body politic in Scotland. Do you think there's, in public authorities, and perhaps you can tell me what, and I should know this, but what public authorities, what areas you cover, not just public authorities, but do you think there's a real understanding of the need to meet the requirements of those that file requests for freedom of information? Are there any pockets that perhaps are not doing what they should be doing?
Well, that's an easy question with a very complex answer, I think. In terms of authorities that we cover, it's obviously government and it's executive agencies, local councils, other public bodies, higher education. Sorry?
You cover the judiciary.
We don't cover the judiciary. We do, in a limited sense, cover the Crown Office, but not in relation to their investigation of crime functions. As to whether there are pockets, I don't think you could say by sector or authority type there are pockets. My experience over the last 2 years has been that generally public bodies in Scotland try to be open. They try. On the whole, there's always the bell curve, and there are extremes, but I would say the extremes of where we don't always find compliance are more to do with individual cases or an individual authority than a particular type of authority. As to whether there are consistent themes, I would say the issue is not one of desire to be open or understanding that FOISA is here and you have a statutory duty. I think that what the issue is more about is how we handle some of our freedom of information requests, because one of my observations about how freedom of information is reported very often is that it reports the process rather than the information. So if you look in the press, it's, an authority is accused of being secretive because they're probably not being secretive. They probably just didn't handle the request well. And this is something that we're trying to put increasingly into our guidance as take a more customer-focused approach. Don't think of it as just a statutory duty. Think of it as a way of engaging with requesters, because if we communicate better, we are more likely to comply with the legislation anyway.
Okay, thank you.
Cameron Buchanan.
Good morning. Are you satisfied that the amount of inaccurate information in response to the Freedom of Information Act is coming through? There seems to be an awful lot of inaccurate information. Is the percentage-wise is high?
It comes back to what we mean by inaccurate. As to are the numbers on the page correct or not, then we can't, I would say we would all struggle to know if it was inaccurate to the nth degree. So if, for example, minutes of a meeting were published and somebody said, no, these are inaccurate, the only way you could know if they were truly accurate is to go and interview everybody who was at that meeting and ask them, is this your recollection? And this is the point I mean by FOISA actually gets the information out there so that those best equipped for that issue can challenge it. As to whether there is inaccuracy in how Freedom of Information Scotland Act is applied, and I think this was my take on Mr. Chisholm's experience, is that the inaccuracy to me was how the request was handled, because there is no, it's highly likely that the first time he was given information, it was inaccurate in the sense that it did not answer the whole question. By the time he received all the information the authority held, I can only assume that he was content it was accurate, and it's that element that I probably see more of, where the authority has not disclosed everything they hold in relation to a particular request. And sometimes it's down to things not being found, searched for properly. Occasionally it's down to a difference in view about how an exemption is applied. But I think it would be too sweeping a statement to say there is widespread inaccuracy, because if we think of the millions of documents that go out, could any of us hand on heart say that the documents we issue are 100% accurate all the time?
A point on that particular question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. I'm just picking up on that point, and specifically Mr. Chisholm's situation. Mr. Chisholm's salient point in all of this is that had he not been aware that the initial information was inaccurate, he would have taken the initial information as gospel, and to coin a phrase, and it would have been done and dusted. And in his response to your previous letter, he said that I would suggest that I should have been able to ask for an SIC investigation as soon as I could provide evidence of the Council's inaccurate response.
I think this is where we're getting probably into a difficulty with semantics in many ways, because he could have come to us to say he was dissatisfied with the way the authority had handled his request, and the result of that is likely to have been that we would have made them disclose all the information that they held, so ultimately he would have got the accurate information. But even in that context, I believe it was legal expenses, we couldn't know that every number on the page was correct without actually doing quite a lot of research by going to the can I see your invoices, can I see, which theoretically you could do, going to the law firm, is this what you actually charged? So the actual objective accuracy on the page I think applies to anything. The one thing I would say, though, is that as soon as information is made public through a Freedom of Information request, it is not just given to that individual person. It is there for everybody. It is public information at that point. So sometimes it's not even requesters who challenge what they find. It's sometimes other people who look at it and say, that can't be right, and challenge it that way. But I think the difficulty with this one is that it only went part way through the freedom of information process. So we can only speculate, really.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. It's really to follow on from Angus MacDonald. Is that you gave a figure there in terms of your research. In the past year, there's been 60,000 FOI requests to public bodies, and only 1% of them have resulted in issues being raised. It does beg the question in terms of Mr Chisholm's petition about the accuracy that, to say there's 60,000 requests, it could potentially be that 59,000 of them, the information is not fully given. And it's how the confidence in the FOI system that we currently have in Scotland, ensuring that people do get the accurate information the first time round, rather than going through the appeals process. Now, we're fortunate, Mr Chisholm, and as we now know from the decision on the 1st of May, that certain individuals are particularly diligent in knowing that there is information available, and that basically they were able to then follow that through and challenge the authority because they knew there was information there that the authority had not released as part of the FOI request. How could you say that the other 59,000 FOI requests are being so diligently followed through, and that we are actually getting the majority, or the 99%, as you indicated, of those FOI requests are being answered accurately with all the information that's been requested at the time it's requested?
Well, the short answer is, I think it would be humanly impossible to know that 100%. What I can say is I have a degree of confidence that comes from a range of sources. So if I look at the statistical information itself, it gives some indication of the sorts of exemptions and reasons authorities give. So we ourselves receive information requests, and I know for absolute certain that 50% of those, it's not about me. They ask me for information that other bodies hold. So some types of requests don't result in any information, and you can be confident in those. There are those requests then, and many, probably many, are the partial disclosure of information. And I think when I look at the things that come to me, authorities give out what they hold. And I think this is the key thing about FOISA. It is about giving out what you hold. So if we were to say, oh, it then has to be checked for accuracy before it goes out, it could actually result in changing what an authority holds. If they say, oh, we made a mistake on that spreadsheet, we didn't add those figures up right. And I think we then get into difficult waters of what is a public record. Do they now hold both? Now, some authorities might notice these things and say, this is the information we hold, but actually we think there's this. And I don't think you can characterise one type of behaviour. Now, as to whether we have other ways of knowing whether this is accurate, I think the confidence element has to come from other parts of my statutory duties. And this is particularly to do with good practice by authorities. And we do a lot of guidance, we hold events, we do briefing. And I think the types of questions and the types of responses I get, I'm confident that if authorities don't achieve it 100%, they try and give out what they hold. They're not required to give specific explanations, but we encourage authorities to communicate and give advice and assistance to try and help the requester understand it. The other thing I observe about where there have been, say, campaigns that have made FOI requests, that the information they get from that isn't the only information they look at. If they're campaigning or researching an issue, they'll have information from lots of places, and it's like any other piece of research, analysis and evaluation. You look at it all and compare and contrast it. As to whether changing the law would make a difference, you must give out accurate information, then we're still in the same place, in the sense of if somebody's not happy, the law says you must give out accurate. Does that mean that you can rely on it 100% when you get it, or do you think the authority still might not have given you the accurate information? And at the moment, you can challenge it in that way by saying, actually, I don't think they've given everything they hold.
Convener, you raise an interesting point, Ms Agnew, in terms of the confidence in relation to the information provided and the accuracy issue. Should anyone making an FOI request not expect that information to be 100% accurate?
I think it's difficult because it would depend on the information. I think if it was something like, can you tell me how much money you spent on X, then I think, yes, they should entirely expect it to be accurate. If there's any inkling of why it isn't, then is it because I haven't been given everything here, and I can challenge it that way. Other types of information, I think, are trickier, because if it was, I would like the economic report on the evaluation of option B of the next phase of the town development, please, then it's very subjective of its nature, because it's about opinions. So at what point do you stop saying something is or isn't accurate? Which is why I think the balance we have at the moment, which is you must disclose what you hold, that makes it public to enable a wider scrutiny, is working effectively.
See, interestingly, that issue about a report that's held on Plan B for the latest town centre development also raises issues about minutes of meetings, and you made reference to minutes of meetings. Now, I've seen public body minutes of meetings which could mean anything to anybody because they're so vague in how they're actually the description of the decision is made and who participated in that decision. How have you had any discussions with public bodies about how they record the decision-making process within the body? Because, as I said, when you look at many minutes, it's a major decision about a multi-million-pound expenditure programme is made and reported in one line. Members agreed on division to agree to go forward with its development. There's no accuracy in there in terms of who voted when, where or what, and the details of the Plan B, as you've suggested, is not detailed to that minute. How do we get that type of information, if someone requests it, out to the individual? Because what you've said is the information that is held by the authority.
I think this is where we get into other legislative frameworks, not just into freedom of information. So, Public Records Scotland Act, how you keep records, how you organise your records. There are issues of conduct. Are you personally carrying out your function properly? But ultimately, I don't think it's my place to say to an authority, you must record your minutes in this way. What I can do is say it is good practice to ensure that your decision, that the information you publish proactively sets out your decision making and holds you accountable to scrutiny. But if we were to get into the territory of a commissioner that then is in a position of telling a council how it must record its minutes, does that mean on the basis that it's public bodies, I have to tell government how to record minutes, I have to tell Parliament how to record minutes? I think there has to be something about authorities managing themselves, and what FOISA gives us is an access to the information for others to be able to challenge how they do that. Because if the public record is not what the public is looking for, then at least they are then able to challenge that in the context of, I think it's inadequate, and others will take up that cause then.
I mean, a final question. You indicated earlier that you give guidance and briefing sessions for public bodies. Does that also apply to members of the public being able to attend those events?
Yeah, I mean, For example, in the last couple of weeks, or couple of months, we've conducted 2 regional road shows, one in Aberdeen, one in Ayr, where we've provided guidance and briefing sessions for public bodies. We've met with local press. We met with as many local MSPs and elected members who can make it. We meet with voluntary groups. We also run events and issue guidance for requesters, particularly through our website, things like tips for making good information requests that are most likely to result in the right outcome in terms of you getting a solid response. So we try and cover the advice and guidance for all parties as much as we can within our very limited budget.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Taggart.
Right, it's going to be an important question. Some of the financial costs to this appeals process. How much does it cost?
In broad terms, I have a budget of around about £1.5 million, and I deal with the appeals within that. I also, within that, do all the advice and guidance work. But I think that's it's really only the end point of it. When you look at the costs of freedom of information and dealing with requests, this is actually an issue that I'm really interested in, because the most effective way to deal with freedom of information requests, which, bear in mind, if we didn't have FOI, people would still be asking questions of public bodies just without an enforceable right behind it, is the best way is for the information to be there for them to look at. So it's trying to encourage public bodies that it's worth investing in getting your records out there in the first place. We are then promoting very much this concept of right first time. So I get very frustrated when I get appeals to me that are on a failure to respond, because I just think it's disrespectful of authorities not to respond. So they could deal with the requests and get it right first time. And many authorities do, and they do well at it. And we know that from feedback that we get. Now, once you've got beyond that, if you then engage that internal right to appeal, and the costs vary between authorities, you're then really ramping the costs up, I think, because appeal reviews internally tend to be dealt with by more senior people. They require an authority doing it properly to actually revisit the case in its entirety. And evidence suggests that most authorities actually deal with it at that point. Where the real cost of appeals comes when they reach me, I don't think is what I spend. I think the real cost of appeals is in responding to my investigations, because they are thorough and they do ask questions and they do probe, and they often require authorities to carry out more work. And what I would hope they learn from that is, if you want to keep the costs of FOI down, invest at the front end and get it right first time.
Could that possibly then be a deterrent for people, the cost of it, whenever we say 1%? Obviously, it's extremely low, but I mean, could that be a deterrent for people to go through this process? It
costs the requester nothing in financial terms. I don't think it's true to say these things ever cost nothing. So it's not like taking a court action. It's a free process. It does involve an investment of time as well, because by the time it reaches me, investigations have to be impartial and fair. So we have to make sure that both parties are asked questions and get a chance to respond. I don't know without extensive research. I suspect if there is anything that puts people off coming to me, it's more likely to be this wider sort of context of complainer fatigue, as in, I've just been waiting so long, I can't get to that point, and I honestly don't know. I don't think it is a big issue, but I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jamidi.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I'd like to stay, if I may, with the issue of public confidence in the regime that exists in Scotland and what you referred to as getting it right first time. Is there any independent research that's been undertaken, either quantitative or qualitative, which would allow us to understand when it comes to making requests, excuse me, convener, when it comes to making, when a request is put in by a member of the public, whether in fact they are the public authority is being deliberately obstructive and not making available all of the information which it holds, or whether in fact it's simply that a junior member of staff is handling the request and hasn't interrogated the information to the extent that they should have. I mean, how do we distinguish between those two, for example? So has there been any independent research which would allow us to get below the surface of some of these issues and understanding what is actually happening when requests are made?
There's one piece of research which we commissioned jointly with the University of Strathclyde about 3-4 years ago, which was looking at voluntary sector experiences of making FOI requests. And the key headings for that was that it was quite, I haven't got the figures with me clearly, but it is on our website. Most of the people who'd made requests had received the information that they wanted to, that they'd asked for, which is very promising. There was the key finding of that research was that there was some concern amongst the voluntary sector about whether making requests for review, taking FOI to the second step, or making appeals to the Commissioner might be seen as a negative behaviour in terms of their relationships with public authorities. And it's an area that we certainly would have liked to have investigated further, but we have very limited means to do so. And we were hoping, but it hasn't come to fruition yet, that somebody might be able to pick this up as an area of further study. I think it is one that is worth looking at.
The other thing I would add as well is I think the actual appeals themselves that come to me are a pretty good indicator of people's perceptions. And they come to us for a whole range of reasons. But increasingly, I'm seeing them come to me because people are dissatisfied with the handling of their information request. And I don't think that's an accuracy issue. I think that's as much a customer service and respect issue.
My colleague, Mr Wilson, was asking about the minutes and information that are held by public authorities. And in that context, you mentioned good practice. I'm just wondering, and I'll give you a specific example in a moment, but as a general principle, how long should a public authority, be it a local authority or any other public authority, hold information? And the specific example that I have in mind is private finance initiative contracts. So a number of those involving health boards and local authorities that have a particular time limit. They may be 25 years or 30 years in duration. And I would be concerned if a member of the public wasn't able to request information during the period of a contract, for example, and was denied information on the basis that the public authority no longer held that information. So do you have a view on that?
It's actually a very good example of where FOI is not the only piece of legislation that counts. Because if you look at the work that the Keeper of the Records is doing in relation to public record keeping, that's now requiring authorities on a rolling basis to have a records management plan. And a key element of a records management plan is a retention schedule, which sets out what sort of documents will be held and destroyed at various times. So this is the sort of document we would expect an authority to publish. We publish our own. And what that... Yeah.
On that, so yeah. Would it be an expectation of good practice that if there was a PFI contract, that there would be an information management plan attached to the actual contract?
It might not necessarily be attached to the specific contract, but I would expect a good retention schedule to refer to that type of document to say they will be kept for the duration of and X months after, or whatever is appropriate, because I'm not trying to be evasive on this. It's just that different documents legally have to be kept for different lengths of time. We also, with PFI and contractual type documents. There may be impacts in relation to procurement legislation as well, which might give other information requirements. So I can't answer the question in terms of I think it should be this many months or days. What I do think very strongly, though, is that an authority should be upfront about how long it keeps particular types of documents, so that if we think that that is an incorrect length, we can actually challenge it in a different way in terms of record keeping, rather than challenging it through Freedom of Information Act. The flip side of this is if a request came, an appeal came to me where I think the requester had a reasonable expectation that the authority should hold a document and was told it was destroyed, so they come to me and we look at their retention and schedule and say, you say as an authority you're going to keep these requests, this type of information for 6 months, yet here we are 3.5 months in. Why is it being destroyed, as you claim? That is actually the way in to check whether the authority is doing what it publicly says it will do.
That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Related to that, what about information that is requested that is denied to a member of the public on the basis that it is commercial in confidence? Are there any case studies or examples where you've challenged that kind of decision?
You got. There have been a couple of decisions on this where we have challenged, and these tend to be. I'm thinking particularly it was Clateau Landscapes, wasn't it? Clateau Landscapes, the wind farming up in Fife, where it was that very issue that was being challenged, and. What we find very often is that, or my perception is that commercial in confidence is not the same as commercially sensitive. And one of the things that we are trying to do through our guidance is encourage authorities that if you are trying to withhold information, use the correct exemption, because things are not often commercially sensitive. They may be commercially confidential, as in disclosing them would be challenged, could be challengeable through a legal process, for example. I would say it's probably the most difficult exemption for an authority to apply, and it's the one that we certainly get lots of requests for advice and guidance, which we will always give authorities. Obviously, we can't tell them how to do a particular case because we can't prejudice our position. But it is something that we issue briefing on, and I don't see it used overly well, I have to say.
I could continue, but I think it's best to stop that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That Chick Brodie.
Thank you. I wonder if I may come back to the openness and the transparency. I mean, 60,000 requests to you is it's a fair number, and goodness knows how many don't come to you that are actually answered. I just wonder if two associated questions. One is clearly in the current, as yet, there are superior bodies that are not Scottish public authorities, but there may be, an issue with getting freedom of information apparently through a Scottish public body, but then has to go to a body elsewhere. I mean, how do you handle that? And the second thing, if I may, you talked about a fine of £5,000. Now, in the spicy briefing that we got, we're talking about Section 65 of FOISA making it a criminal offence to alter, which should be reasonably easy to find, deface, erase, destroy or conceal. What about situations where a public body blocks information or tells someone to go and find the information themselves?
We've a whole heap of things there. My apologies if I misled you. The 60,000 requests are to all public bodies in Scotland, and it was 572 or 573 up to the last financial year that came to me. So that's, yeah. In terms of the information not being held by a public authority, let's say it's held by a contractor. If it's being held on behalf of the public body or it is part of the contractual arrangements. And there's quite a lot on this in the government's guidance under the Code of Practice under Section 60. If it is the authority's information, then they should make arrangements to get it to us. If we're looking at information that is not held by a public authority but they think might be helpful, they can't actually tell that other organisation to give it to them to send to the requester, but they can suggest to the requester, signpost them and give them advice and assistance on how to get to it. I think where we then get to is whether all the bodies that should be covered by Freedom of Information Scotland are actually covered. So this is part of the Section 5 of our Act, designation of new bodies. So we've recently seen an order passed by ministers to make culture and leisure trusts subject to FOI. And this is an area where I actually have more concern, because I think that if we're not careful, we will see an erosion of the enforceable right because things get outsourced or they get moved to the private sector. And it's something which we're currently ourselves researching, because we want to lay a special report before Parliament on how we think Section 5 duties are being exercised and how we think we can make FOI applicable to more bodies, different types of bodies. But ultimately, if the authority's information is held by a third party, then the authority must take steps to get that within the statutory timescales and disclose it as appropriate to the requester.
And the issue of blocking?
The issue of blocking is basically withholding information which you should be disclosing. That's how I would interpret it. And that is the very thing that you can come to the Commissioner on. Now, if the question then becomes, is it simply that it has been mistakenly withheld, or do we think that there is a deliberate attempt to block that information to prevent the request being responded to? And those are the ones that I think you can only know when you have the facts of an investigation in front of you. Because to raise this issue under Section 65 of deliberate attempt to block, I have to be not convinced lock, stock and barrel that there is a definite attempt. There has to be sufficient for me to, or others, to think, no, actually this should be investigated as a criminal matter, and say I see very, very few of those. And I think the reason I see so few of them is because Section 65 is very often related to the conduct of an individual rather than a body corporate. And most organisations, I would say, try and respond to information requests as best they can.
Thank you.
John Wilson, are you?
Could I just ask Ms Agnew to clarify that last statement about the individual or the corporate body or the corporate entity that individual represents?
What I mean by that is the criminal charges, the wording of Section 65 is or any individual employed by or acting on behalf of. So there may be an authority where the suspicion is they have blocked information, but the decision to do that, if it were a deliberate decision, I'm suggesting would be individuals or groups of individuals not representative of an organisation as a whole, always behaving in this way.
Sorry, Convener, I just want to get it clarified clearly that if a local authority, if you were to take a local authority to the Court of Session, proceed with proceedings at the Court of Session against a body, a public body, for not providing the information as requested by either the person requesting the FOI or yourself as a Commissioner, who would you be taking to the Court of Session?
I think my apologies, we've got two types of enforcement going on here. Under Section 65, this is the deliberate attempt to deface or block, and that wouldn't be me taking people to the Court of Session. That would be the matter being turned over to and investigated by the police, and ultimately would be the Crown Office would decide, cops would decide whether to prosecute. Now, if my decision in relation to investigating an appeal to me was that an authority did not disclose all the information it held, and I had no reason to believe it was anything other than they simply didn't do it, I'm not suspicious that it was a deliberate attempt to block in the terms of Section 65. I would only go to the Court of Session if they refused to take the action that my decision said they must take. And that's the action that I have never had to take as Commissioner, and that the previous Commissioner also never had to take, because authorities always comply with decisions so far.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you very much. We're now at the stage, as you know, that we're just looking at the next steps. But can I say to both of you, it's been excellent evidence. I've certainly really enjoyed your insights into this issue. As far as the next steps are concerned, as the committee knows, we've written to the Scottish Government about this issue and obviously are still awaiting some feedback for them. Certainly my suggestion to the committee is that we continue this petition until we've had the information that we've asked for, and obviously to give the petitioner opportunity to comment on the evidence received. That's the normal procedure. So I would recommend that we continue this petition until that information is received. Is that agreeable? Agreed. And can I finally thank both of our witnesses for coming along today. As I said, it was excellent evidence, and I'll suspend for 2 minutes to allow our witnesses to leave. Restart the committee. We're now on PE 1514 by Norman Bonney on making time for a reflection representative of all beliefs. And with the committee's agreement, we'll swap round the agenda items today. Members are note by the clerk, the spice briefing and the petition. And can I welcome Norman Bonney to the meeting and invite Mr Bonney to give a short statement of around 5 minutes, after which we'll go to questions. Thank you very much for coming in different order today, Mr Bonney.
Thank you, Convener, and your colleagues for giving me this opportunity to address the petition that I've submitted, which proposes that the Parliament should attempt to make its weekly time for reflection more representative of the diversity of belief in Scotland. Many people have said to me that I run across in the circles I mix that they couldn't support this petition because they believe that religion and politics should be kept separate, and that the Scottish Parliament should not have religious time. However, I think we should recognise that there is this existing practice of time for reflection in the Scottish Parliament, and what I want to do today is to try and explore ways in which time for reflection can be more representative of the range and diversity of belief in Scotland. People have also said to me, well, why does the Parliament have a special session on religion, the only session which is open to outsiders? Why does it not have time for artists or scientists or others to address the Parliament? And the argument goes that Parliament should focus on governing the country and not engaging in these sorts of activities. But time for reflection is a reality at the present time, and I think it's unlikely the Scottish Parliament would drop it at least before this side of the referendum. So this petition puts forward an attempt to find common ground between the religious and the non-religious. The petition proposes an equal opportunities approach that suggests a way in which this common ground can be developed. After all, equal opportunities was an original ambition of the Scottish Parliament and continues to be one of its orienting features. But I would argue that the Parliament is falling down in its ambition for equal opportunities in relation to time for reflection. The original debate in 1999 showed that some MSPs had concerns that organised religion would have disproportionate weight in time for reflection. Indeed, Alistair Morgan, an SNP MSP, expressed that very concern in that initial debate in 1999. And Mike Russell, an MSP at that time, not a government minister, reassured him that groups like humanists would also get opportunities. And perhaps it's by sheer chance today time for reflection is to be conducted by a humanist. But one swallow doesn't make a spring, and in my reckoning this is the third, and some of the publicity it says the fourth humanist to address time for reflection out of 450 sessions of that time. And if you look at the statistics which I've worked on and which the Parliament also reports upon, 87% of contributions in the current parliamentary session since 2011 are from religious contributors, whereas we know from the 2011 census that only 56% of Scots then said they were religious. More recent survey information, which I've made available to you, points out that 49% of Scots today say, I would not describe myself or my values and beliefs as spiritual or religious. So organised religion has come to dominate time for reflection, even when the original intention was that TFR should cover the whole diversity of beliefs. Tom McCaig, the business manager at the time of the 1999 debate, said that time for reflection should be for all the main beliefs in Scotland to reflect the diversity of the country. But we can't say this is the case if 87% of contributions are religious. I argue that in some ways we have deficiencies in parliamentary practice in relation to time for reflection. Parliament has allowed itself to be influenced by outside bodies. The Scottish Church's Parliamentary Office on its website claims that it advises the Parliament on who should appear at time for reflection. The Scottish Church's Parliamentary Office also claims that time for reflection is like thought for the day. But that's not my understanding of what time for reflection was originally meant to be. Thought for the day on the BBC is exclusively for religious contributors. But time for reflection from the beginning has been for the diversity of belief in Scotland. It also appears, if you look at the statistics, that in practice over the years, Parliament has been operating with quotas. Those quotas determine that every year the Church of Scotland makes the most contributions to TFR, the Roman Catholic Church the second most common. That other Christian denominations are greatly overrepresented, and non-Christian denominations are greatly overrepresented. If you look at the consecutive sessions of the Scottish Parliament from 1999, non-Christian denominations have contributed 13%, 16%, 12%, and now 17% of all contributions to time for reflection. But non-Christian denominations, if you look at the 2011 census, only compose 2.1% of the Scottish population. So I'm suggesting that TFR needs to get its contributions more in accordance with population proportions. And in particular, needs to give much greater prominence to contributions from atheists. The latest survey data, which again I've made available to you, suggests that firm atheists, people who have no belief in God or any higher spiritual power, are something like 25% of the Scottish population. And therefore I argue the Parliament should make available 25% of the time for reflection for atheists. There have only been a handful of explicit atheists who have made contributions to time for reflection in the 15 years of the Scottish Parliament. I would hazard a guess, actually, that there's quite a significant proportion of MSPs who are atheists too, but they don't make a public admission of that. We know that from public records, about 1 in 3 MSPs declare a religious affiliation, mostly Christian. And if MSPs are representative of the population as a whole, 25% of them at least would be atheists, and I suspect more than that. And what about the gender aspects of time for reflection? We know that women are more religious than men, and yet most religious denominations are in fact dominated by men. Women are excluded from the priesthood in at least 3 of the denominations that make contributions to time for reflection. Surely Parliament needs to think more about this issue. And this is especially the case if you look at the Scottish Cabinet decision recently to make 40% of places available to women. Should not time for reflection have a quota for female contributors to try and balance the dominance of men in religious denominations? Why not set a quota of 40% of places in TFR for female contributors rather than the 30% we're seeing in the current parliamentary session? Or that quota could be set even higher to encourage denominations to think more about the way in which women are often second-class citizens in time for reflection. There was broad guidance developed for the performance for the way in which time for reflection was practiced in the Scottish Parliament in 1999. Spice says that the Parliamentary Bureau plans to look at census figures in the near future. Well, the census was 3 years ago. In the near future is not a very positive commitment. I think the Parliament needs to take a much more active stance in evaluating its current practices in relation to time for reflection. Then there's been no public parliamentary review of time for reflection since 1999. There is a lack of clarity of policy about how particular participants are selected. Yeah. Okay.
But we're a bit short of time today. Obviously, if you take too long for your statement, you won't have any time left for questions.
Have I exceeded my 5 minutes?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So my point is that there needs to be open parliamentary consideration of the way in which time for reflection works and how it might be improved in order to make it more reflective of the pattern of belief in the country. And I would particularly stress the importance of applying equal opportunity principles in this respect. And perhaps I'll have an opportunity to develop that in a subsequent time.
Thank you for your opening statement. You've made a number of points around changing time for reflection. In practice, how would that actually happen? How would you actually change the organisation of time for reflection?
Well, firstly, I think the Parliament itself has to have an open public debate about whether it's satisfied with the way in which time for reflection operates. And I think if it saw the sorts of figures that I've offered, it would begin to realise that it needs to think more closely about how to operate time for reflection. There are all sorts of ways in which I mentioned the application of equal opportunity principles. One would have thought that a Parliament committed to equal opportunity principles might apply them in this area of time for reflection, which after all it considers to be a very significant part of its business, putting aside time every week for time for reflection. And so we need to see how equal opportunity principles can be applied to time for reflection. And one of the major points I make is the underrepresentation of atheists in time for reflection. And one straightforward way of trying to fill that gap would be to follow the simple principle of advertising. After all, it's generally accepted when you have posts to be filled that you have public advertisements. And I think the Parliament must be prepared to put more time and effort into selecting who is involved in time for reflection, and to fill this gap that I've identified, a public advertisement inviting applications from people to make contributions might well bring forth proposals from atheists, and that could help fill that gap.
Thank you for that. And my final question, would you accept in general terms that parliamentary staff do attempt to have a widespread and diverse group of contributors for time to reflection? And of course it's open for any member of the public and indeed any MSP to put forward recommendations as well.
Yes, I've no doubt that staff follow the guidance that they have as to how they should operate TFR. What's at issue here is the policy and principles that are followed in filling slots available for time for reflection, and that's something which I think the parliamentarians must reflect upon so that appropriate instructions can be given. And I suspect that too much power and influence is given to the churches through the Scottish Churches Parliamentary Office and through the Interfaith Network, Interfaith Scotland and so on. Because if you look at the religious contributors, this is clearly a channel through which the presiding officer can quickly find someone to fill an appropriate slot to fit in with a pattern of contributions that are thought appropriate.
Thank you for that. Chip Brodie.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Bonney.
Hi there.
What's your objective by having humanists present time for reflection? Have you attended any of the time for reflection?
No, but of course one can see it online. And I understand that the attendance is not often that great by MSPs at that time for reflection. In fact, I've heard it said by one contributor that she was disappointed that all the MSPs were not listening to her but were standing outside having a chat until the session was over. But what I'm drawing your attention to...
We all take time to reflect on our own particular gods from time to time. It doesn't have to necessarily be in the chamber. What's your objective?
What's my objective? To draw the attention of Parliament to the way in which it seems not to be living up to its principles of equal opportunity and having time for reflection as a session which reflects, if I may just finish, to reflect the full diversity of belief in Scotland.
You've accepted that it's not well attended. Some people say regrettably. So I'm not clear as to what, and I think certainly all of my colleagues are fairly discriminatory in terms of how they approach various things, particularly their own particular philosophies. I'm still not sure why you feel you're being denied something that cannot be propagated, more widely than just in the Parliament.
Well, I mean, the Parliament is a very special body, representative of the people of Scotland, with great ambitions to have even more powers in that field. And I think it has to demonstrate to the people that it is fully representative. And I'm afraid what we see in time for reflection is a religiously dominated time, when there, as I've pointed out, about half the population can reasonably be said not to be religious. And so ways have to be found to hear the moral views of that half of the population that is not religious.
I'm still at a loss as to see what the 5-minute advantage per week would bring that couldn't be done by propagating your philosophy on a much wider spectrum.
Well, I mean, we are talking specifically here about time for reflection, and so it's the practice of time for reflection that we're focusing on here, and it's an important public arena, and I think MSPs must give more consideration to what goes on there and amending their practices.
Just one last question. What do you think we should do about the oath of loyalty and the oath we take when we become MSPs?
That's actually an interesting point, because I've analysed the percentage of MSPs who affirm, and it's about 40% of MSPs affirm rather than swear in the Bible. So that's another indicator perhaps of the non-religious element in the Scottish Parliament. And so I hope those members might want to speak up a bit more to hear the atheist and non-believing voices in time for reflection.
Thank you.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Bonney. The issue that you've got before us in terms of the petition is you've indicated and you've given percentages in terms of those in the census who declare a religious affiliation or belief affiliation, and you then extrapolate from that 25% of the sessions for time for reflection should be presented by atheists. Now, you've came up with a novel idea of putting it out to open advert for atheists to come forward. When we have representatives of religious bodies, we know they are representing a particular body. How do we know that if we do invite atheists along, apart from those involved in the secular society and the humanist society, how do we know that they are genuinely atheists and they will present a genuine atheist case at time for reflection?
Right. Well, thank you for that question. Firstly, by the way, secular societies are not necessarily atheists. The religious people can be secularists who believe in the separation of church and state. So you don't need to be an atheist to be a secularist, which is one reason why I've put this forward in my own name rather than getting the backing of an organisation. I suppose what you're saying is that when you get someone from a religious denomination making a contribution, you know what they're broadly going to say. But do you just take it on trust that a particular religious denomination will put forward a person who is reasonably representative of those points of view? If we want to have a representative time for reflection with atheists involved, the Parliament will have to spend some time. It could invite applications. It can try and see that it gets a diversity of views from atheists, and you will find. I've tried to examine what we know about the characteristics of atheists, and if you look at the social survey data, they seem to be a pretty representative bunch of people, actually. They're pretty to be found in all parts of society. They're not very distinctive in any way other than the fact that they don't believe in religion. And so I would expect you would get a diversity of views. But what I'm suggesting is that Parliament needs to think a bit more about how it can get such a diversity and give due recognition to that 25% of the population which says it doesn't believe in God or any higher spiritual power.
Could you indicate, Mr Bonney, whether or not you made this case that it's overly represented in time for reflection by religious organisations? Has every religious organisation or belief organisation in the Scottish Interfaith Council been invited to give time for reflection?
I would guess so. I couldn't say precisely, but certainly the overwhelming majority, yes.
But the majority, not all.
Well, I can't be that specific. There may be an exception. I doubt it.
The other issue that, in terms of time for reflection, we often use time for reflection not only to invite religious people along to give time for reflection, we've also invited individuals from the voluntary sector and the public sector to come along to give time for reflection. How would you balance this out? Would that be your other 25%? Because you've identified 75%, so your other 25% we would be permitted to invite people from the voluntary sector as long as they weren't from a voluntary sector organisation that had religious affiliations. Is that what you're arguing?
Yes, I mean, this 25% I haven't identified would be open to the Parliament to decide on what its priorities should be, and that would include voluntary groups that do, at present, make occasional contributions.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner.
Thank you for that. Do other colleagues wish to ask any questions or points? No? Thank you for that. As you'll know from your previous experience, the next step is we look at how to deal with your petition. And certainly, I think it's important that we do write to the presiding officer who chairs, as you know, the Bureau, who's responsible for the allocations to get the presiding officer's view on this petition. And again, can I ask the committee's views on this? Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. In doing so, in writing to the presiding officer, can we highlight Mr Bonney's comment that there has been no review of time for reflection since 1999 as part of the letter?
Could I also suggest that the views of the Equality and Human Rights Commission be obtained as to whether time for reflection meets the legal obligations upon the Scottish Parliament in terms of equal opportunities? This was something which I meant to raise and develop.
Thank you for that. We're just at summation. It's really just for the committee, but I'm sure the committee will take that point on. Do members agree, first of all, on Angus MacDonald's contribution and Mr Bonney's comment, John Wilson?
Convener, could I suggest we also ask the presiding officer, and I know Mr Bonney's given us some figures in terms of breakdown, but could I ask the presiding officer for the breakdown in the last 3 years of time for reflection, who has given time for reflection, and what body or religious organisation they have represented during that time for reflection? Because, as I said, I'm aware that there have been some public sector and voluntary sector organisations represented, but it would be useful just to get that type of breakdown in the last 3 years in this session of Parliament. The other issue, Convener, I would like to raise is I think we should write to the Scottish Interfaith Council to ask them their views, because I don't think that everybody that's involved in the Scottish Interfaith Council is automatically invited to give time for reflection. And I think there is an issue, and Angus MacDonald's right, about the time for reviewing the procedure for selection or allowing people to come along for time for reflection. Having said the Scottish Interfaith Council also suggests, Convener, we write to the Humanist Society and the Secular Society for their views as well on this issue. Unfortunately, the 1.5 million atheists out there, I don't think we could write to all them individually, but hopefully if they're listening to this broadcast in this committee, we might get some views from members of the general public who may wish to contribute to this debate by making a written submission.
Are members agreeable with John Wilson's contribution? Amit Taggart?
Could I just add a wee bit on to what my colleague John Wilson has just asked for there, and whilst asking the presiding officer for a breakdown over the last 3 years, can we also ask for the gender balance as well, please? And also, there has been children that has delivered time for reflection, schools that has delivered time for reflection here as well.
Thank you for that. And Angus MacDonald?
Yes, thanks, Convener. To add to the list of bodies to contact, could we also include the Independent Celebrants Association? Yeah, I have the contact details if they're required.
Does any other member have any further contribution? If not, then I think you've obviously heard we're continuing your petition, and obviously we'll discuss this at a future date once we've got all the information back. And can just finally thank you for coming along and giving your statement and being our witness today. And there's a suspend for 2 minutes to allow Mr Bonney to leave. Thank you.
Human Rights Commission.
Yes, that If we can resume our committee, we're on agenda item 2, and we're on PE 1513 by Ron Park on equal rights for unmarried fathers. Members will note by the clerk, despite bringing the petition. And John Lamont, MSP, has a constituency interest. Thanks for coming along today. And I'll ask Mr. Lamont at some stage to make a brief comment. Mr. Park, who's in the gallery, unfortunately is now not able to give a statement, but the committee, I think, exceptionally will agree that Margaret Park will read out a statement on behalf of Ron Park. Obviously, we won't put questions to you, Mrs. Park. The committee will then consider the petition, and as I said, I'll ask John Lamont to make a brief statement after that as well. Can I ask then if Margaret Park, you could just read out the statement, and we won't question you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, can I thank you all for allowing me to speak on behalf of my son. These are my son's words, and I'll read it as he's written them. In addition to what I'm sure you've already read in my petition, I'd like to share one more set of statistics from the General Registry Office. In 2011, of the 29,888 births registered in Scotland, 3,123 were registered to a sole parent. That is an incredible 10.4%. Taking into consideration that a child is a person under the age of 16, it can then be estimated that there may be as many as 50,000 children whose births are registered to sole parents at this current time. Keeping this in mind, I'd like to focus our attention toward the United Nations Convention, the Rights of the Child, specifically Section 9, which states, "You should not be separated from your parents unless it is for your own good. Children whose parents have separated have the right to stay in contact with both parents, unless this might hurt the child. A right which, by failing to require both parents to be named on a birth certificate by law, either amicably, by mediation, or as a last resort by a court order, paternity testing, we fail to guarantee every child born in Scotland, and in far too many cases, a right we fail to uphold altogether." This goes hand in hand with fathers' rights, and both speak to the very same grey area within our current laws, in that unmarried fathers have no right or legal right until court awarded. As such, the child cannot see them. The measures I have proposed, or measures otherwise determined, will give family courts the power to enforce paternity testing in extreme cases, be it against the mother's wishes or the father's, and requiring by law that within a predetermined timescale, every effort should be made and every avenue exhausted to name both parents on an amended birth certificate, so as the child has their full rights protected and upheld, and they may have access to both parents, and indeed that both parents have legal and binding responsibilities in relation to their child, if these are, of course, in the best interests of the child. I would like to close by quoting one of the comments posted on my petition, which I'm sure all of you have read. It came from a woman known only as Pauline, and these are Pauline's words. "It is totally unacceptable for a father to be denied parental rights under any circumstances, unless he is an unfit parent. I speak from personal experience as a child. I was not allowed to see my father. My mother denied him his rights by denying that he was my father, even though she continued for many years to accept financial support from him. Both my parents are now dead, and I only ever got to meet my father once as a young adult. It was too difficult to develop a relationship due to all the anger and rejection felt by both of us. I pray that this legislation will be changed so that no other child has to deal with the pain of rejection for no reason other than spite of the other parent. This, as I said, is the voice of a child failed by our current legislation, a child who quite obviously has suffered and continues to suffer into adulthood. We have failed to protect her rights to the best of our abilities. I feel this has to change, and I feel my proposals set forth are a step in the right direction to rectifying this terrible situation we continue to place some children in. Mothers and fathers have to be considered equal in terms of rights and accountability and responsibility, given the precedence one over the other is an outdated notion. A child needs both, and if that is at all possible and in the child's best interests, this is what we should be striving for every single one.
Thank you very much for coming along and reading out statement very much at last late notice. I do appreciate that. John Lamont.
Thank you, Convener. Can I thank the committee for allowing Mrs Park to provide evidence on behalf of her son this morning. I understand it's an exceptional case, and I'm pleased that you've been able to listen to Mrs Park, and I think Mrs Park has done remarkably well, given she didn't have any time to prepare, so well done. Ron Park has been in correspondence with me regarding the difficulties he's been having obtaining access to his son. I think he contacted 87 other MSPs as well, so you may have had correspondence from him. I've been pursuing it as his constituency MSP. I've been in contact with the Minister for Community Safety and Legal Affairs, and whilst I think the Scottish Government does have some sympathy with the position that Mr Park finds himself in, they say they don't have any plans to amend the law as it currently stands, which is why Mr Park has decided to pursue his issue through the committee as he has done. I think it's important to remember Mr Park's not just doing this on behalf of himself. He is championing the case of many others in Scotland who find themselves in a similar position, and I hope the committee will look at his case with some sympathy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, obviously we can't put questions direct to Mrs Park, but my understanding, just looking through the brief, is that in England and Wales there's a rationale and legislation of presumption of shared parenting. Would you say that's a good comparison with what the petitioner would want for Scotland? Sorry, it was John Lamont.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to, at the very least, be looking at the position in other countries to see how they have dealt with this issue. And I'm not saying that necessarily is the position that we need to be or we want to be in Scotland, but certainly we need to be looking at it from other perspectives to find out what the best case scenario would be for Scotland.
Thank you for that. Just throw it on to comments, contributions from members. Chip Roddy.
Yes, thank you. Well done. And thank you, John. I too have had correspondence with Mr Park, and I think it's a very brave petition. It would seem to me that notwithstanding the comment that has been made, that there are opportunities for declaration of parentage that might be followed. I just wonder if you can comment, Mr Lamont, John, on the issue of DNA evidence and how that might be pursued.
I'm not familiar with the exact detail of how this works, but my understanding is that the court, a Scottish court, cannot force somebody to provide a child for DNA sampling, and that, I suppose, is the root of the problem. If you can't force the child to provide the sample, there's no way of ascertaining its parentage. So, and that is as from the correspondence I've had with the Minister, that is a key point of law which the government's not prepared to look at.
Could I just remind members that, of course, John Lamont's not here as a witness, so it was perhaps not fair to the light. Fell into that trap, as you'll know, earlier on.
Just looking for his superior knowledge.
I think we're all clear on Mr Lamont's superior knowledge, but I think there is information we would need to write to various organisations. John Wilson?
No questions.
Target?
Yeah, thanks, Convener, and thank you again for bringing this important petition to us this morning. And yes, you're exactly right, Convener. We do have to, or I would like for us as the committee to be looking at seeking more information to enable this petition to move forward. And part of that information most certainly would be is of the English and Wales model.
Thank you. Would members agree then we need to seek further information on this important petition, such as the Scottish Government, the Law Society of Scotland, Family Law Association and Families Need Fathers Scotland as a starting point? John Wilson?
Can I also add in Scottish Women's Aid, because I think there is an important issue here, and I think the petitioner in the submission that's been made has identified there may be issues around why the mother decides not to register the father on the birth certificate, or what wishes to engage further with the child's father in relation to the relationship that exists. So it would be useful to get a view from Scottish Women's Aid on some of the issues around the questions that have been raised by the petitioner, so that we've got a balanced view in relation to the responses.
Are committee members agreeable with John Wilson's suggestion? Any further suggestions, Amit Taggart?
Thank you, Convener. Really just about it would be folly of us not to mention about the work that the Equal Opportunities are currently doing just now. And I am aware that there may well not be on this exact topic. However, could we possibly have an update and a summary of where they're at with their investigation?
Yeah, thank you for that. Chick Brody?
Yes, if I may. And can I don't know about the rest of the members of the committee, but this strikes a chord not far away from the profound inquiry we did on child sexual exploitation. We try to pride ourselves on having a society that's equal, and I'm sure that by pursuing the routes that we've talked of, I don't know if there's anything we can do with a review of the 1995 Act and any information that we might be able to get from the UK government in terms of experience. So that might be an area. But this is, I said, a very brave petition. It's sad that this has not been sorted before, and my mind immediately turns to children who try to find out who their father is and are unable to do so in later years because of no registration. So I commend Mr Park, as I say, for the bravery in bringing this forward, and I sincerely hope that it's something that we will not drop easily.
Do you wish the committee then to write to the UK Minister? Right. We'll find the appropriate Minister and write there. Any additional comments from members? Are members happy with that course of action? As other members said, could I thank Mrs Park and Mr Park for coming along today, and for John Lamont as well. This is a very difficult area. Obviously the committee are going to pursue this with as much activity as it possibly can and clear it beyond the future agenda. So can I thank you all for coming along, and I'll suspend for 2 minutes to allow our witnesses to leave. Thank you. Can restart. Addenda item 3, consideration of current petitions. The first is PE 1458 by Peter Cherbi on register of interest from members of Scotland's judiciary. Members of a note by the clerk is paper 4, and the submissions. Members will know that at the last meeting we sought permission from the conveners group to get a date for a plenary session. The conveners group has looked at that, and a date will be allocated in due course. Once we've got the date, we'll make sure you're informed about that. As you know, the Judicial Complaints Reviewer has supported this petition, and also the petitioner urges us to ask Lord Gill for historical data on recusals, which are still to, I think, still to follow through. Historical.
No,
you're probably right the first time. So the next step is then how we deal with petition. Certainly, since we're going to have a date in the Chamber, I would suggest that we continue this petition until we've had a full debate in the Chamber as a whole. But again, I would take contributions from members. John Wilson.
Convener, thank you. Can I say that we seem to be where we are in an impasse in relation to this debate. But I think the latest submission from Moy Ali opens up a number of issues. And I think from her unique position as the Judicial Complaints Reviewer, she certainly brought or more evidence, to my eyes anyway, in relation to the situation that currently exists. And I know that we've had a response from the Lord President and the Cabinet Secretary, but based on the latest information from Moy Ali, I'm keen that we have the debate in the Chamber, but I'm also keen to get the views, the current views, of the Lord President and the Cabinet Secretary in response to the latest Moy Ali paperwork, because I know that the issues that she raises, I would like to see, rather than the one-page, three-paragraph response that we seem to get from the Lord President and the Cabinet Secretary. It's almost as though it's scripted. In fact, the Lord President's comments, when he makes reference to the Cabinet Secretary, nor himself are minded to actually open up this issue to review, that I think it would be useful for this committee, prior to any debate in the Chamber, to ask the Cabinet Secretary and Lord President what are their detailed views on the issues raised by Judicial Complaints Reviewer, because I think the Complaints Reviewer, as well as the oral evidence she gave previously, has raised a number of issues in this document that I think require more detailed scrutiny, but also require more detailed responses from the Lord President and the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you for that. Are members agreeable with John Wilson's suggestion? Okay. Any other further contributions? Angus MacDonald.
Just to add to John Wilson's point, can I just place on record that I'm grateful to the additional information that's been provided by the Judicial Complaints Reviewer. I think the information that she's provided us with certainly gives us some issues that we certainly do need to follow up, and I'm happy to second John Wilson.
Thank you for that. Any further contributions? Are members happy then with the course of action, which is that we are continuing this petition? There will be a debate in a plenary session of Parliament and the date to be resolved, and there's a couple of other issues we need to chase up with Lord Gill and the points that John Wilson made as well. Is that agreeable?
Sorry.
Yes,
this information is on the website, is it? This letter?
Is that agreeable?
Yes.
Thank you for that. If I can move then to our next current petition, is PE 1492 by Alan Kennedy on co-location of GP practices and community pharmacies. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. Members will know that some of the crucial landmarks that we had was first of all the Wilson-Barber review, which I think was a first-class review of this issue, a consultation by government, and I understand that findings will be published shortly, and we're expecting amendments to be submitted prior to the summer recess. Obviously, there's a number of potential options for the petition. I would suggest to the committee that we don't close it at this stage, that we actually defer consideration to a future meeting following the publication of the Scottish Government's report on its control of entry consultation and presentation of the draft regulations. Members agreeable with that course of action? Thank you for that. The next current petition is PE 1495 by Rob Wilson on the use of gagging clauses in agreements with NHS staff in Scotland. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. Members will know that the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing on the 27th of February has said that confidentiality clauses will be removed from standard NHS settlement agreements in Scotland and will only be used where there is explicit agreement between both the employer and the employee. So obviously it's up to members to decide how we deal with this. Obviously the two main options would be to close the petition in light of that, or again, as we did on the petition with Alan Kennedy, is continue the petition to analyse what is actually happening in practice. Sorry, Jim Eady?
Clear from the correspondence which the committee has received from the Scottish Government and from the Cabinet Secretary that there's a clear commitment to remove confidentiality clauses from standard NHS settlement agreements in Scotland. My concern in closing the petition would be that we weren't able to continue an ongoing scrutiny function in terms of the implementation of government policy by health boards in Scotland. I've just asked the committee to pause and reflect on that point before taking a decision.
Would you wish to recommend, Mr Eady, that we continue the petition?
I think we should consider that before taking the point that I've made before taking a position to close the
Thank you
petition.
for that. John Wilson? If you...
Convener, there is an issue, and I think you highlighted the Cabinet Secretary's wish that we remove these gagging clauses from any settlements that take place between an employer and an employee, and any agreement in terms of the clauses should be dealt with in that manner. The difficulty is that many of the settlements that take place between an employer and an employee are subject to employment legislation, and it's whether or not, as I think Jim Eady's alluding to, and if I'm wrong, you can correct me, is the fact that it may be very difficult to get to the debate and discussion that takes place at a meeting between an employer and an employee as to whether or not these gagging clauses are actually enforced in financial terms, because there are ways that employers can actually indicate that not by directly stating that any settlement may be subject to a gagging clause, that basically, and it's how we get that information from the HR departments of the various health boards throughout the country in relation to the individual discussions that take place between an employee and an employer. And I think Jim Eady's right that we should keep this open and have further scrutiny of the practices put in place by HR departments and health boards throughout Scotland, so we do get an accurate reflection, and they are reflecting what the Cabinet Secretary has indicated he wishes to see happening, rather than a backdoor discussion that basically allows this practice to continue.
I think that's a useful point. I mean, one possibility would be if we wrote again to all Scotland's health boards in 6 months' time and said, can you just confirm what your actual practice is, so we're getting it direct from the horse's mouth. Chip Brodie? Sorry, John.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that the Cabinet Secretary and/or the Minister are now getting involved in signing off a compromise agreements, although I can't imagine they're going to be signing all of them off. And I think that in itself demands that we keep this petition open, because it will allow us to understand better the rationale behind what has been happening, notwithstanding the signing of compromise agreements, which in some cases, I know that the Minister for Health, or Cabinet Secretary for Health in England, believes that these will not stop people speaking out. Well, that's not been the case, as we found again just last week. So, or last 2 weeks ago, I think it's important that we continue, as Jim Eady says, the ability to scrutinise this petition.
Right, thank you for that. Are members all in agreement then that we continue this, and we will do a date in the future and write to health boards? John Wilson?
I was just going to say, and Chip Brodie is right, I think where we will get the evidence, and the petitioner has been quite good at bringing forward evidence to the committee and highlighting cases where compromise agreements are being forced upon employees. But I think if we agree to keep it open for 6 months, I'm sure if there are any cases out there, they will come back to this committee and we will be made aware of any difficulties that may exist, in particular health boards.
Thank the committee for consideration of that petition. Can I move then to the final current petition? It's PE 1507 by Alicor and Sophie Pilgrim on behalf of the Scottish Children's Services Coalition and Kindred on funding for additional support for learning in Scotland. Again, members have got a note, paper 7 and submissions. One possible action here is that we wish to close the petition under Rule 15.7. Given that the Scottish Government is liaising with local authorities in the provision of ASL and the petitioners have withdrawn their request, in doing so, the committee may wish to ask the Scottish Government that it keeps the petitioners informed of its work in this policy area. Can I ask for views? Is that agreeable, or do members have a contrary view? Right, thank you very much for that. And that comes to the end of our meeting. Can I formally close the meeting and ask members if they could stay behind for a couple of minutes?